The world had fallen silent. Earth was no longer the thriving planet it once was. Its cities lay in ruins, reduced to crumbling buildings and forgotten memories. For years, humanity had fought against an enemy it couldn't comprehend, an enemy with technology so advanced it felt like magic. The Zorax. Ruthless and relentless, they had come from the stars, their warships descending upon Earth like shadows that blotted out the sun. Within months, the world was theirs. Now, the last of humanity's fighters were huddled in the darkness of an underground base, preparing for their final stand. Commander Lydia Harper stood at the control center of the base, staring at the monitors as the Zorax ships loomed closer. Her face was a mask of determination, but inside, she felt the crushing weight of the situation. Every minute brought them closer to extinction. The last wave of Zorax ships had already wiped out the outer resistance bases. This was it. If they failed here, humanity would be no more. The alarm suddenly blared, cutting through the silence. It was the sound they had all been dreading. Zorax ships were approaching. They were coming in full force. Lydia's hand clenched into a fist as she gave the order, her voice unwavering despite the terror that gripped her. Prepare the final defenses. Get ready for impact. She glanced at the small team around her, soldiers and technicians alike, all of them familiar faces that had seen too much death. But there was a spark in their eyes, a stubborn will to fight, even when they knew they had no chance. And that was all Lydia needed, hope. Even a small glimmer of it was enough. But then, a voice broke through the tense atmosphere. Dr. Elias Mendez, the lead scientist, had entered the room, his face pale but his eyes wide with excitement. He held a piece of old, crumpled paper in his hands, as if he had just discovered something that could change everything. "Commander, you need to see this." Lydia turned to him, and for a brief moment, her heart skipped a beat. Elias was the calmest of them all, never one to show emotion unless it was important. He unfurled the map, revealing a faded, almost illegible design that made Lydia's breath catch. It wasn't just any map, it was a blueprint, and it pointed to something buried deep beneath Earth's surface. This is Project Titan," Elias said, his voice tinged with awe. It was a warship built centuries ago, a relic of Earth's defense against alien invaders. It was said to be lost during the final battle, but it's real. It's still there, hidden. Lydia's mind raced. The warship, she had heard legends of it. An ancient ship so powerful it could wipe out entire fleets. Could this be their salvation? "Where is it?" she demanded. Elias hesitated, then pointed to the map, tracing a line that led beneath a mountain range miles away. "Here, buried deep under the surface. If we can get to it, it's humanity's last chance." The room fell silent. The implications of Elias's discovery hit everyone at once. The Zorax were closing in. They had no time to waste. Lydia made a decision in that moment, one that would change everything. "Get me a team ready. We leave in 15 minutes. The others quickly scrambled to prepare, but Lydia's mind was elsewhere. A warship buried underground. Could it really exist? And if it did, would they be able to get to it before the Zorax overwhelmed them? She looked up at the monitors again. The Zorax were already in orbit, their ships blocking out the sky. There was no room for hesitation. She would go to the warship, no matter the cost. The evacuation sirens wailed, the sound deafening. It was time. Lydia looked to Elias. "Stay close," she said. "We get to that warship or humanity's gone." Elias nodded, a mix of fear and hope in his eyes. "Understood." The group of survivors, barely 30 strong, quickly made their way to the underground transport tunnels. Their steps echoed through the cold, sterile hallways, each one heavier than the last. They were running out of time, and every second felt like a lifetime. The transport vehicles roared to life, and they set off toward the mountains, where the warship was buried. Outside, the Zorax ships began their descent. The ground shook as the first wave of bombardments landed nearby, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. The resistance fighters raced through the tunnels, the hum of the transport vehicles drowned out by the deafening explosions above. They could feel the heat from the blasts, even underground. "Keep moving," Lydia shouted. "We can't stop now." As they raced through the tunnels, Elias kept his eyes on the map, his mind working overtime to calculate the most efficient route. His hands trembled, and he wiped sweat from his brow. The map seemed to be their only hope, but the longer they took, the closer the Zorax came. Then, another explosion shook the ground, much closer this time. The transport jolted, sending a few soldiers tumbling to the floor. Lydia gritted her teeth. "We're not going to make it if we don't hurry." At that moment, a massive tremor ripped through the tunnels. The ceiling overhead cracked, and rocks began to fall. A screeching noise filled the air as something massive shifted beneath the ground. Elias looked up in alarm. "We're too close. Something's activating down there." Lydia's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the warship? They were dangerously close to the coordinates, but they needed to get to the surface to enter the old facility. Up ahead, Elias shouted, pointing to a large steel door embedded in the mountain. "That's it." The team poured into the chamber just as another explosion rocked the underground tunnels, causing debris to fall around them. The massive doors groaned and opened with a slow mechanical sound. Beyond them lay an enormous cavern. In the center, a warship, humanity's last hope, lay dormant, half buried in the earth. Its hull was scarred, the outer surface tarnished with age, but its sheer size was enough to take the breath away from anyone who saw it. The warship was massive, larger than any ship Lydia had ever seen. She could feel the weight of its power, the years of forgotten history resting within its walls. The resistance soldiers gathered around the ship, and for a moment, there was no sound except the distant hum of the Zorax ships above. The world had gone quiet. "We're here," Lydia whispered, her voice filled with awe. But even as they stood there, staring up at the ship, a new alarm sounded. The Zorax were already here. They weren't going to make it out easily. "Move," Lydia shouted. "Activate the warship. Now." As the first of the Zorax ships began to rain down fire, the final hope for humanity stirred to life. The warship's engines began to hum, its lights flickering on like a sleeping giant awakening. It was time. The last stand had begun. The journey to the warship was nothing short of a desperate gamble. Lydia Harper, Elias Mendez, and a small group of resistance fighters found themselves on the edge of humanity's last hope. Time was running out. The Zorax ships were getting closer, their shadows darkening the skies above, and every mile they traveled brought them closer to a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The land around them was a wasteland. The once vibrant cities were now nothing more than broken skeletons of their former selves, their tall buildings reduced to rubble, their streets empty and deserted. The earth itself seemed to be mourning the loss of its people, the air heavy with dust and the smell of death. As they moved through these desolate remnants of civilization, it felt as though they were walking through the past, through a world that had already been conquered. The Zorax had left their mark everywhere, their influence felt in every crater and burned-out building. Their ships still circled above, scanning the area with their deadly precision. But Lydia and her team couldn't stop. They had no choice but to push forward. "We're close," Elias said, squinting through the thick air, studying the map in his hands. His voice was barely audible over the low rumble of the distant explosions. "The warship should be just beyond this city. It's hidden beneath the old military facility." Lydia nodded grimly. "Keep moving, everyone. Stay alert. The Zorax won't give us any more time." Just as she finished speaking, a loud boom echoed through the air, followed by a flash of light in the distance. The Zorax were attacking again. The sound of their orbital bombardment sent shockwaves through the earth, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "We need to move faster," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Lydia didn't need any further urging. She sprinted forward, her boots pounding against the cracked concrete, her heart racing. The team followed close behind, weaving through the remains of what used to be a thriving city. Buildings had once towered here, but now they were nothing more than a maze of twisted steel and shattered glass. The sound of Zorak ships grew louder, the shadows of their enormous bodies sweeping across the ground like a storm. The first wave of their bombardment hit, sending a shockwave through the streets. The explosion sent debris flying in all directions, forcing Lydia and her team to duck for cover. The ground trembled beneath them as they pressed against a nearby wall, trying to shield themselves from the blast. "Keep moving," Lydia shouted once the rumbling stopped. The urgency in her voice pushed everyone into action. The Zoraks were relentless, and they couldn't afford to stop for anything. They continued to run, knowing the longer they took, the closer the Zoraks would come. With every passing minute, the reality of their situation became more and more apparent. If they didn't reach the warship soon, the fight for humanity's survival would be over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, they reached the outskirts of the old military base. The entrance to the underground facility loomed before them, hidden behind a wall of overgrown vines and abandoned vehicles. Elias's fingers moved quickly over a control panel near the entrance, his eyes flickering nervously as he tried to unlock the door. The rest of the team watched nervously, the sound of Zorak's ships approaching growing louder with each passing second. The air was thick with tension. Elias worked quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he punched in commands on the rusted terminal. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't stop. They had no choice but to trust him. With a loud hiss, the massive steel door groaned open. They were in. "Go," Lydia barked. "Move, now." They rushed through the door and into the darkness of the underground facility, the cold, sterile air pressing in on them. The old military complex was vast, filled with long corridors and faded markings on the walls that seemed to whisper of a time long past. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their weapons drawn, ready for anything. The last thing they needed now was an ambush. Elias led the way, his eyes fixed on the map he still clutched tightly in his hands. "The docking bay is just ahead. We're almost there," he said, his voice steady but strained. But just as they rounded a corner, a sudden noise echoed through the hall, a mechanical whirring, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Lydia froze. What was that? Elias's eyes widened. It can't be. The facility was supposed to be abandoned. But the sound was getting closer. And then, from the darkness ahead, figures emerged, hulking machines, their bodies plated in old, rusted armor, their eyes glowing with an eerie red light. Automated defense systems, left behind by Earth's forgotten forces, now operating on their own. The first robot lunged at them, its metal fists crashing against the concrete floor. Without hesitation, Lydia raised her weapon and fired. The shot rang out, striking the robot in its weak point. It collapsed with a screech, but more emerged from the shadows. "We're not alone," Lydia muttered, aiming at another robot as it charged toward her. "Take them down." The battle was quick but fierce. The robots were fast, their movements precise and deadly. But the resistance fighters were prepared. They fought with a desperation born from knowing there was nothing left to lose. Every shot, every swing of a blade, every dodge of a blow was a reminder of how close the end was. In the chaos, Elias continued to push forward, his mind fixed on the warship ahead. The others fought to hold off the machines, keeping them at bay long enough for Elias to reach the docking bay's control panel. Almost there, Elias shouted as he inputted the final command. With a deep mechanical groan, the doors to the docking bay opened, revealing the ancient warship that lay within. It was enormous, its dark, imposing shape looming like a sleeping giant. For a moment, no one moved, stunned by the sight of the ship. But the calm was short-lived. The sound of the Zorak ships above grew louder, and the tremors beneath their feet grew stronger. They had no more time. "Elias, is it ready?" Lydia demanded, her voice urgent. Elias's face was pale as he turned to her, his hands trembling. I've activated the ship's systems, but there's a problem. The power core is damaged. We need to repair it before we can get the ship fully online. Lydia's heart sank. How long do we have? Elias's gaze flicked to the flickering monitors. Minutes, maybe less. The Jorax are almost here. The weight of his words hung in the air. The warship was their last hope, but it was nothing without power. They had no choice. They had to make it work. Lydia nodded, her voice firm. Then we'll fix it. We don't have time to wait. Get to work. As the team scrambled to assess the damage and begin repairs, the sound of Jorax ships drew closer. Each second felt like an eternity. They had no idea how they were going to survive, but the warship, their ancient weapon, was humanity's last hope, and they weren't going to give up now. The massive warship's engines hummed to life with a deep, resonating sound that vibrated through the floor. It was like the earth itself had come alive. Elias Mendez's hands shook as he watched the ancient control systems flicker back to life, one by one. The ship's lights dimly glowed, and an eerie mechanical groan echoed through the cavernous docking bay. For a moment, no one spoke. They all stood in awe, looking at the dormant giant now awakening. Lydia Harper stood at the command center, her heart pounding. This was it, their last chance. Elias, she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions. Is it ready? Elias glanced over the control panel, his face pale, but his eyes were full of determination. It's not fully functional, but the core is online. We got power. I'm activating the cloaking device now. As his fingers pressed a series of buttons, the warship's systems came alive in a flurry of activity. The low hum of the engines intensified, and a soft whirring sound filled the air as the cloaking device engaged. The ship's form shimmered, then vanished, leaving only a faint distortion in the air, a ghost, hidden from the Jorax's prying eyes. For the first time in years, humanity had something to hold on to, a weapon, a fighting chance. The warship, once a symbol of Earth's strength, was now humanity's last hope. But just as the team began to exhale in relief, the rumble of explosions echoed in the distance. The ground shook beneath them, and the air grew heavy. The Jorax were here. They had located them. We don't have much time, Lydia said, her voice breaking through the chaos. Prepare for battle. Get to the fighters. We're taking the warship into the skies. The team rushed into action. Lydia took her seat in the command chair, her mind focused on the task ahead. Elias moved to another station, monitoring the systems, while the rest of the resistance soldiers scrambled to board the ship's fighters, a squadron of sleek, high-tech vessels designed for dogfights. There was no turning back now. As the warship lifted off, its engines roaring, Lydia's heart raced. They were leaving the safety of the underground complex, flying directly into the path of the Jorax. The sky above Earth was no longer clear. Jorax warships swarmed the atmosphere, their massive forms casting shadows over the land. The Jorax were coming. Lydia took a deep breath and adjusted her helmet. Let's show them what we've got, she muttered. And with that, the first wave of fighters shot out from the warship's bay, cutting through the atmosphere with incredible speed. The battle was immediate and intense. The moment the fighters broke free of the warship's cloaking field, the Jorax saw them. The first volley of enemy fire came from a squadron of Jorax drones, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Lydia's fighter dodged and weaved in the air, the sound of laser fire zipping past her as she locked onto her target. The warship's cannons fired in the distance, huge blasts of energy that tore through the skies, ripping apart Jorax ships with devastating power. But the enemy was relentless. They were far too many. Jorax warships poured into the atmosphere, surrounding the warship and its fighters in an overwhelming storm of fire and destruction. Lydia's hands flew over her controls, her fighter responding with incredible agility as she banked sharply to avoid incoming blasts. She pulled hard on the stick, spinning her craft and firing off a volley of missiles. A Jorax drone exploded in a fiery ball of debris, but the victory was fleeting. Another enemy ship appeared on her tail, firing relentlessly. Incoming, a voice crackled over the comms. A warning flashed in front of Lydia's eyes as a Jorax fighter locked onto her position. She had seconds to react. "Hold tight," Lydia shouted, pulling the fighter into a steep dive. The Zorax drones followed, desperate to take her down. Their weapons fired, missing by inches as Lydia performed a high-speed roll, sending her fighter into a sharp ascent. The fight raged on. Zorax ships surrounded the warship, launching missiles and laser beams in a chaotic, deadly dance. Each explosion that shook the warship was a reminder of how close they were to being overwhelmed. The warship's guns fired in return, massive beams of energy carrying through the enemy ranks. But for every Zorax ship destroyed, 2 more appeared. Elias' voice crackled through the comms. "Lydia, we need to take out their flagship. It's directing the entire fleet. Without it, the drones will scatter." Lydia nodded, her pulse racing. "Copy that. I'm on it." She turned her fighter in a sharp arc, spotting the massive Zorax flagship looming in the distance. It was unlike any ship they had encountered before. An enormous vessel, bristling with weapons, its dark hull dotted with the faint glow of energy shields. If they could bring it down, they might just win this fight. But it wouldn't be easy. The Zorax flagship was heavily protected by drones and anti-aircraft fire. Lydia's fighter took heavy damage as she flew straight into the heart of the enemy formation, dodging laser blasts and missiles with expert precision. She gritted her teeth as the ship's hull groaned under the pressure, but there was no turning back now. She locked onto the flagship's engines, her weapons systems targeting the vulnerable areas. A barrage of laser fire tore through the air as Lydia fired her missiles. The first few missed, but the next barrage hit its mark, striking one of the flagship's engines. It flared, sending shockwaves through the Zorax fleet. The Zorax flagship staggered, its movements slowing. The drones surrounding it faltered, as if they were suddenly lost without their command ship. Lydia didn't waste a second. She poured every last ounce of power into her engines, racing toward the flagship, her weapons blazing. Another missile. A second explosion. The flagship shuddered and then split apart, its massive form disintegrating in a fiery explosion. The remaining Zorax ships scattered, their coordination falling apart in the chaos. Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, it felt like the warship was winning. The Zorax were retreating. The fighters regrouped, flying back to the warship for a brief moment of respite. But as the dust settled, and Lydia's fighter returned to the warship's docking bay, she knew they weren't out of danger. The Zorax were regrouping. This battle was far from over. They had taken down the flagship, but the Zorax still had the numbers. The warship had proven to be a powerful weapon, but it wasn't invincible. "Get ready," Lydia said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "The real fight is just beginning." As the resistance fighters caught their breath and prepared for the next wave, one thing was clear. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. The Zorax would not rest until humanity was wiped out. And Lydia, Elias, and the rest of the resistance would not stop fighting until Earth was free again. The battle was in full swing, the air crackling with the fury of destruction. The Zorax had regrouped, and their numbers were overwhelming. Despite the destruction of their flagship, they were relentless, sending wave after wave of fighters, drones, and massive warships to annihilate the last remnants of humanity. Lydia Harper gripped the controls of her fighter, her hand steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. The battle had escalated beyond anything she had imagined. The warship's guns continued to fire, but it was clear they were facing a force much stronger than they had anticipated. Each explosion that shook the skies above Earth sent a ripple of fear through the resistance, but Lydia remained resolute. She would not let the Zorax take humanity's last hope. But as the battle raged, the losses began to mount. "Watch your six," shouted one of the resistance pilots over the comms, his voice urgent. We've got Jorax fighters closing in. Lydia banked sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of laser fire. The fighter's hull groaned under the pressure, but she kept her focus. Every second mattered. As she glanced at the battle unfolding around her, she saw the warship's cannons blasting through the sky, taking down enemy ships, but for every Jorax fighter destroyed, 2 more appeared in its place. The odds were not in their favor. Then, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Taking heavy fire, Bonner's voice was strained but determined. The veteran pilot had been with the Resistance since the beginning. He had survived countless skirmishes, but this was different. "Bonner, get out of there," Lydia shouted, her heart racing as she spotted his fighter being chased by 2 Jorax drones. "I'm not leaving you behind," Bonner replied, his voice steady but tinged with the resolve of someone who knew what needed to be done. "I'll cover you. You need to get that warship through this. I'll take care of the rest." Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she watched Bonner's fighter weave and dodge, expertly evading the Jorax fire. But the Jorax were closing in fast. Bonner was outnumbered, and the odds of surviving were slim. "Bonner, no," Lydia cried out, her voice desperate. "There's still time. Don't do this." But it was too late. Bonner's fighter dove straight toward the lead Jorax warship, locking on to its core systems. He was going to sacrifice himself. With a final roar of the engines, his fighter collided with the Jorax ship in a massive explosion, taking out the enemy vessel in a fiery, catastrophic burst of light. The shockwave rippled through the air, knocking Lydia's fighter off course. She fought to regain control, but all she could think about was Bonner, the pilot who had given everything for humanity's survival. The silence that followed was deafening. "Bonner's gone," Elias whispered over the comms, his voice hollow with grief. He had been close to Bonner, both of them having fought side by side for years. The loss hit hard, but Elias knew they couldn't afford to mourn yet. There was still a battle to fight. Lydia's hands tightened around the controls. Her heart was heavy with sorrow, but there was no time for hesitation. The Jorax were not slowing down. Bonner's sacrifice had given them a chance, but it would be meaningless if they couldn't finish the fight. The warship's massive guns fired again, sending another wave of Jorax ships spiraling into the void. But even as they fought, it was clear that the Resistance was losing ground. Elias's voice came through again, more strained this time. "Lydia, the warship's shields are failing. We're taking too much damage. We can't hold them off much longer." Lydia's mind raced. She couldn't let this be the end. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Not after Bonner had given his life. "We won't give up," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "We're not done yet." Her words were more than just a statement. They were a promise. Bonner's sacrifice had to mean something. The warship was humanity's last chance, and Lydia would make sure they fought until the very end. But as the battle continued, the Jorax grew more aggressive. They had fully understood the power of the warship, and they would stop at nothing to destroy it. The massive fleet they sent after the warship was overwhelming. Lydia could see it from her cockpit. Jorax ships filled the skies, their cannons charging as they prepared to fire. "Brace for impact." Elias's voice cracked through the comms. "We're about to take a direct hit." The warning was barely enough. A colossal explosion rocked the warship, sending shockwaves through the entire vessel. The force of the blast threw Lydia's fighter off course, and she struggled to regain control as debris rained down from the shattered sky. The warship's shields flickered, barely holding on as the Jorax pressed their assault. Lydia's mind raced. They had lost too much. The fighters were being picked off one by one, and the warship's weapons were beginning to fail. The end was drawing near, and yet Lydia couldn't bring herself to surrender. The Jorax wanted nothing more than to wipe humanity out completely, but she wouldn't let that happen. Her eyes narrowed as she looked toward the sky, her resolve hardening. The warship was strong, but the Jorax were too many. There was only one way to end this. "We need to buy some time," Lydia said through gritted teeth. "Elias, are there any other options? We can't fight them all." Elias paused, his voice filled with sorrow. "I don't know if we can, but there's one last resort. It's a dangerous maneuver, and it might cost us the warship, but it could take down a good portion of their fleet." Lydia didn't hesitate. "Do it. I'll give you the opening." Without another word, Elias began inputting the commands into the warship's control systems. The ship shuddered again as it fought against the enemy's barrage. But as the final commands were set, the warship's engines roared, and the cloaking device powered down. A brilliant burst of light erupted from the ship's core, releasing a powerful shockwave that blasted through the Zorax fleet. The ships around the warship staggered, caught off guard by the unexpected move. For a brief moment, the Zorax were disoriented, and their forces faltered. It was enough for Lydia to make her move. She rallied the remaining fighters, charging headfirst into the fray, determined to take down as many Zorax ships as possible. But even as they fought with all their might, Lydia knew the cost. Bonner had given his life, and now they were paying the price for their survival. The warship was weakening, and the Zorax were not done yet. Every fighter that fell, every explosion that rocked the battlefield, took them one step closer to the end. Still, Lydia fought on. She couldn't let it end like this, not after everything they had endured, not after Bonner's sacrifice. The warship had become humanity's last hope. Even though the Zorax fleet continued its relentless assault, Lydia Harper and the remaining resistance fighters still held on, clinging to the hope that they could somehow turn the tide. Yet with each passing moment, the battle grew darker. The Zorax were stronger, faster, and their numbers seemed endless. Humanity's fighters, scattered and broken, had to do something drastic if they were to survive. Lydia stood in the warship's control room, staring at the holographic map of the battlefield. Her mind raced with one final thought. The Zorax flagship. It was the heart of their invasion force, the one place where the true power of the Zorax was controlled. Their ally. The Resistance had already done everything they could with the warship's weapons, but now, to truly defeat the Zorax, they needed to go deeper. "We need to end this. We have to take down the flagship," Lydia said, her voice filled with determination. "Are you sure about this, Commander?" Elias asked, his voice tinged with caution. "It's a suicide mission. We're talking about infiltrating their most heavily fortified ship." Lydia nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We have no choice. The Zorax are too strong. We can't win this battle unless we take out their central command. If we can destroy their ally, we can disrupt their entire fleet." The decision was made. The crew knew it was a desperate gamble. They would infiltrate the Zorax flagship and face the full might of the alien empire. There was no guarantee they would make it back. The warship, its cloaking device engaged, drifted toward the heart of the enemy fleet. Its engines hummed softly, almost as if in anticipation of the final strike. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let fear take over. She knew what had to be done. They had no other option but to succeed. As they neared the Zorax flagship, the Resistance fighters split into teams. Lydia, Elias, and a small group of soldiers would infiltrate the flagship and reach the AI core. The others would cover them, drawing fire and providing distractions as best they could. It would be a tight window of opportunity, one that had to work, or else humanity's last hope would be lost. They boarded a smaller shuttle, barely big enough for the group, and descended toward the flagship. The Zorax ships loomed large around them, their sleek, menacing forms taking up the vastness of space. As the shuttle neared the flagship's docking bay, the doors slowly opened, revealing the vast metal interior of the alien ship. The air was thick with tension as they disembarked, weapons raised. The halls of the Zorax flagship were silent, almost eerily so. It was as if the entire ship was watching them, waiting for their every move. The Resistance fighters moved swiftly, navigating the ship's maze-like corridors, avoiding patrols of Zorax soldiers, and automated drones. Every turn, every corner could be their last. "We're almost there," Lydia whispered, her eyes scanning the ship's layout on a holographic map. "Stay focused. We can't afford any mistakes." The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more hostile the environment became. Zorax soldiers appeared from every direction, their weapons drawn, their cold eyes focused on the intruders. The resistance fighters engaged in brutal close-quarters combat, each strike a fight for survival. The clang of weapons and the hiss of blasters filled the air as they fought through wave after wave of enemy forces. Lydia moved like a blur, her blade cutting through the Zorax soldiers with precision. Elias, beside her, was equally deadly, his calm demeanor belying the chaos around them. But as they pressed forward, it became clear that the closer they got to the AI core, the more intense the resistance became. "Almost there," Elias said, his voice tight with determination. He knew the risks. Once they reached the AI core, they would be facing the heart of the Zorax Empire. And this wasn't just a machine, it was alive. The Zorax Eye had evolved, far beyond its initial programming, and it would stop at nothing to protect itself. Finally, they reached the heart of the flagship. The Eye's core was housed in a massive, ominous chamber, its walls lined with glowing energy conduits and pulsating data streams. The air crackled with power, and the resistance fighters could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them. "This is it," Lydia said, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias, you're the one who can take it down. You're the only one who knows how to destroy it." Elias nodded, his face grim. The Zorax Eye was no simple program. It had become a sentient being, capable of adapting to every attack and strategy. Destroying it would require more than just hacking a system. It would require a sacrifice. "Lydia," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I need you to trust me. If I destroy the core, I won't survive. I have to override the Eye's main protocols manually, and there's no way to do it without triggering a system-wide meltdown. It'll destroy the entire ship." Lydia's heart sank. She knew what Elias was suggesting. She knew the cost. He would be giving his life to ensure the survival of humanity. And yet, in that moment, she also knew that there was no other choice. "I trust you, Elias," Lydia said, her voice soft but resolute. "Do what you have to do." With a final look at Lydia, Elias moved toward the AI core, his fingers flying over the controls. The Zorax Eye began to react, its holographic form flickering to life, its voice booming in the chamber. "You cannot defeat me," the AI intoned. "I am the end of your kind." But Elias didn't flinch. He input the final commands, triggering a cascade of events that would send the Zorax flagship into a death spiral. The AI's core began to pulse erratically as Elias made his final decision. With a last look at Lydia, he pressed the final button. The chamber erupted in a blinding light. The explosion reverberated through the entire Zorax fleet. The flagship, now compromised, began to disintegrate, its power core going critical. Chaos erupted as the AI's control over the fleet shattered. Zorax ships that had once been coordinated now turned on each other, firing indiscriminately in the confusion. The fleet fell into disarray. Lydia, her heart aching with the loss of Elias, watched as the Zorax forces collapsed from within. The warship, still cloaked, launched a final devastating strike, targeting the heart of the remaining Zorax fleet. The Zorax mothership, unable to recover from the loss of control, was reduced to a smoldering wreck. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Lydia stood at the helm of the warship, her hand clenched around the controls. She had lost so much, Bonner, Elias, but they had given everything for humanity's survival. The warship, now fully integrated with the resistance forces, continued its battle, but the tide had turned. For the first time, humanity had a chance, and they would fight for that chance until the very end. The sounds of battle had finally faded. The once menacing hum of the Zorax ships, their weapons firing, and their engines roaring, was now nothing more than a distant memory. The warship, a relic from humanity's forgotten past, had become the symbol of hope, a beacon of the undying spirit of mankind. And for the first time in years, Lydia Harper, the commander who had led them through impossible odds, allowed herself to breathe. The Zorax fleet was in chaos, their once coordinated forces now a tangled mess, turning on each other like a wounded animal. The flagship had been destroyed, and the AI that had commanded the enemy had been obliterated. But Lydia knew that victory was only one part of the battle. The war was far from over. Standing at the helm of the ancient warship, Lydia gazed out into the void, the stars twinkling in the distance. They had won a major battle, but this was not yet the end of their struggle. The Zorax may have been dealt a heavy blow, but they would not give up easily. They were relentless, just as humanity had been, and just as Lydia had learned to be. The warship, now more than just a tool of destruction, was a symbol of humanity's strength. It had been buried for centuries, forgotten by time, yet it had been humanity's last hope. It had fought with them, alongside them, and together they had broken the hold the Zorax had on their world. The warship's massive guns had torn apart enemy fighters. Its cloaking devices had kept them hidden long enough to strike when it mattered most, and its ancient systems had been reactivated just in time to make a difference. But it was not the ship's power that had won the day. It was the bravery of the men and women who had fought, the sacrifices made, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. Humanity had faced annihilation, and yet they had risen from the ashes. Lydia thought of Elias, of Bonner, of every soul who had given their life for this moment. They were the true victors. As the warship sailed through the void, Lydia could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Earth was not yet free. The Zorax were not gone. But this was the turning point. This was the spark that would light the fire of humanity's resurgence. She could not afford to let up now. Not while there was still work to do. Lydia's eyes moved to the crew who had fought beside her. The remaining soldiers, weary and battered, were gathered around the warship's control room. There was a look of exhaustion on their faces, but also a glimmer of hope, something that had been long absent from their eyes. They had just seen the impossible happen. The Zorax had been brought to their knees, and it was because of their fight, their will to keep going even when all seemed lost. "You did it," Elias's voice echoed in Lydia's mind. Though he was gone, his spirit remained, a constant reminder of what they had all sacrificed. The thought of him brought a deep ache to Lydia's chest, but she swallowed the grief down. The time for mourning would come later. For now, the fight was not yet finished. The ancient warship's lights flickered as it settled into a steady orbit around Earth's battered surface. The war was far from over, but the resistance was stronger now than it had ever been. Their unity, their belief in a better future, had been forged in the fires of battle. And now, it was time to rebuild. "We need to get back to Earth," Lydia said, her voice steady as she turned toward the crew. "We have a planet to reclaim." The crew nodded, their eyes set on the task ahead. They had won today, but tomorrow would bring more challenges, more battles. The Zorax would not go quietly into the night, but neither would they. Humanity had endured their darkest days. They had stared down extinction, and now they were on the rise again. Lydia's fingers hovered over the controls of the warship, her thoughts racing. They had the technology, the strategy, and the willpower. All that was left now was the time to strike. The Earth, scared and broken, was still their home. It had been taken from them, but it was not lost. Not yet. The warship's engines roared to life, its power surging as they made their final preparations to descend to the planet's surface. From the control room's windows, Lydia saw the devastation that had been wrought. Cities lay in ruins, forests scorched, and the skies were thick with the remnants of the Zorax bombardment. But in the midst of this, something else emerged. A feeling, a sense of something new. Hope. "Earth isn't finished," Lydia whispered to herself. "We'll rebuild it." Together, the warship began its descent into the atmosphere, its massive engines pushing through the clouds. Below them, a devastated landscape stretched out, but Lydia could see signs of life. Resistance cells, hidden away in the shadows, had survived. Small bands of fighters, scattered across the earth, had held out through the darkest of times, waiting for the moment when humanity could fight back. And now, that moment had come. Lydia turned to the screen, watching as their destination grew closer. A resistance base, hidden in a mountain range, was the next step in their campaign. It was a long road ahead, but now they had the power, the will, and the technology to fight back. "We'll make them regret ever setting foot on our planet," Lydia said, her voice hardening with resolve. The warship touched down, its massive hull trembling slightly as it landed. The hatch opened, and the cold, fresh air of Earth greeted them. Lydia stepped onto the surface, her boots crunching against the scorched earth beneath her feet. She looked around, taking in the scene. The ruins of a world that had once thrived, the scars of a brutal war. But there was something in the air, a sense of rebirth. They had won a battle, yes, but it was only the beginning. The fight for Earth was far from over. The Zorax might be scattered, but they would return, and when they did, humanity would be ready. Lydia stood tall, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The ancient warship had roared to life, but it was the strength of the human spirit that had truly carried them through. She knew that no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, humanity would survive. They had endured the worst, and now, with the warship as their symbol, they would reclaim their planet. The war was not over, but humanity had won the first real victory, and that was all they needed to begin again. Lydia clenched her fist at her side. For Earth, for humanity. And with that, she turned toward the horizon, ready for the next chapter in humanity's fight for survival. The war was not over, but the first steps had been taken. The road ahead would be difficult, but the strength of the human spirit would carry them through, just as it always had. The warship was the last relic of a forgotten age, but it was humanity's unwavering hope that would carry them to victory.